Let's talk about Kamala Harris being accused of plagiarism, which could threaten to derail the final stages of her election campaign. So in 2009, Harris wrote a memoir which was called Smart on Crime, A Career Prosecutor's Plan to Make Us Safer. And this was while she was district attorney of San Francisco. She was trying to build her political profile. Like many of these books, she used a ghostwriter, a person called Joan O. Hamilton, and that was the book, and everybody accepted it. But now, 15 years after that book was published, we've got an Austrian academic named Stefan Weber, nicknamed, incidentally, the plagiarism hunter, claiming that Harris has plagiarised big portions of that book. He's produced a whole report. He says there's 27 examples of plagiarism, from minor transgressions to serious infractions. His report includes big passages he claims have been lifted from Wikipedia or news articles without attribution. One example is she appears to have borrowed from Martin Luther King in an anecdote from her childhood during the civil rights movement. So Harris wrote, "My mother used to laugh when she told the story about a time I was fussing as a toddler. She leaned down to ask me, 'Kamala, what's wrong? What do you want?' And I wailed back, 'Freedom,' which she spells with a W because she's trying to channel her inner toddler." This appeared eerily similar to an anecdote once told by King, who said, and I quote, "I will never forget a moment in Birmingham when a white policeman accosted a little black girl, 7 or 8 years old, who was walking in a demonstration with her mother. 'What do you want?' the policeman asked her gruffly, and the little girl looked at him straight in the eye and answered, 'Feed 'em,' again in a rather childish voice." Is that plagiarism, Kamal?
Whether it's plagiarism, how these things are put together is always can lead to slip-ups when they're rushed, not because you want to write a book, but because you want to make a case. Do you remember Rachel Reeves and her book on economics, which was then criticised for having seemingly the ghostwriter lifted chunks from different places, possibly Wikipedia? This seems to be slightly similar, and I think in a way the relevancy is quite low. We don't really remember that. It was a row for a couple of days, but actually people don't really think these books have been sweated over by Kamala Harris for... It takes 2 years to write a really good book. The idea is that this thing, some bits have slipped in from elsewhere for the books like this that are produced in this way, I don't think is that damaging to a person. And also, as you say, Stefan Weber, he hunts for this stuff. And if you look hard enough in books like this, you are going to find material. I'm assuming the book is many hundreds of pages long. If that's the best they can do, I don't really have a sense that this is hugely damaging. But, and we're going to get onto this, of course, in a very tight election race, it only needs some minor infractions or some people to think, does this add into a sense that how serious is Kamala Harris? Does she really have a grip on politics? Is she really a details person? The fact that she has done few to almost zero big interviews with mainstream big journalists. We had the editor of Time magazine complaining that she could be one of the first presidential candidates not to do the traditional Time interview.
Well, let's speak about that, because she's basically gone completely down the podcast route, which you and I can completely endorse.
We agree with. She's welcome on this podcast anytime she likes.
As is her opponent, who I'm sure you'll get on famously with.
Oh, yes.
But she has done, well, she's basically chosen to hone in on two of the most popular podcasts in America, and actually they're sort of either side of the ideological divide, which is quite clever. So she's gone on Call Her Daddy, which is quite progressive and young and appealing to liberals, and she's planning apparently to go on Joe Rogan, which is a bit more blokey and I would say a bit more Republican leaning and a bit more sort of red meatish.
Yeah.
So that's quite clever, isn't it? It does open her to accusations of not facing enough scrutiny, because with the greatest respect to those podcasters, they're not what you would consider mainstream media journalists.
Yeah, because you need to do a lot of research. I'm not suggesting for a moment that she shouldn't be doing different ways of communicating with people. I think that's interesting. You know, we have literally launched a daily podcast because it's a way of audiences getting information in different ways. But in journalism and for big journalism and for big journalistic organisations, we have researchers, we have producers, we do a huge amount of work on what are the details of these issues, and we know how to interview people so that the first answer they give doesn't end the conversation. You know, we have techniques to try and get to the truth of an issue rather than just allow someone to soundbite us into submission. And given that Kamala Harris has been criticised in the past for not being clear, maybe not knowing the detail, the rigour of a journalistic interview is an important part of what you should be doing. And just like we were discussing Robert Jenrick at the top of the pod, he has at least gone out there and done the interviews. Yes, it has meant there's been maybe some more missteps, but the very fact that he has put himself in positions of scrutiny with serious journalists, I think is always to be applauded. It's not an either or, I think it's an and. And I'm not sure that the plagiarism row, it feels slightly weaponized against her. Will it really have an effect on people? I'm not sure.
She clearly wants to tap into what's known as the manosphere, though, if she's doing Joe Rogan.
Yeah, that's a real bros thing. Yeah,
yes, call her daddy is quite sort of female-leaning and has a female listenership. I mean, I think we can probably agree that when it comes to young female progressives who are anti-abortion, Harris is probably already sorted on that count. Is she able to convince some of the people that listen to Rogan? Is she able to convince some of the blokes and that more blokey audience that listens to Joe Rogan and might be more Trump-leaning to come across to her side? I mean, this plays in nicely to our next piece of audio, because clearly the people advising these two presidential nominees are trying to tap into these little pockets of support. They've got to get support wherever they can, Kamal. And this means actually swerving completely away from their traditional fan base. We've got those people nailed. You know, we know who is supporting us. How do we convince those people who are still undecided?
And just to add to that, you've got two things to do. How do we get to undecideds and move them across? And it could just be a few tens of thousands of people. And how do we motivate our base to go out and vote? So you've got to achieve two things in your campaign, because it would be all very well getting those few floating voters to come across to you. But if your base doesn't come out, you could lose anyway. And given that in the last election, it was the highest turnout that had ever been seen in a presidential election, I doubt we'll get to those numbers this time, because that was a real battle between, Democrats and Trump, who was, of course, the president at that time. But nevertheless, this is likely to be a very high turnout and also a very close fight. So you've got to motivate your base, get them out to vote, and you've got to try and find, wherever you can find them, rummaging around the bottom of the back of the sofa, any votes where you can get them.
And let's just have a look at the polling as it stands now. The polling company in the US, 538, puts Harris 2.4% ahead of Trump on average. We've also had a poll by NBC News, which had Trump and Harris tied on 48% each. And that's after Trump recovered from a poll slump brought about by his debate performance. He wanted that to be better. It wasn't. And then, of course, as we've discussed on the podcast before, Kamal, the result is going to be decided by just a few tens of thousands of voters. So in 2020, about 43,000 votes among Wisconsin, Georgia and Arizona. So that's 0.03% of all votes. Tiny, tiny, tiny amount handed Joe Biden his win.